Hi comrades, welcome to this special episode of Sin Patron on May Day around the world. As many of you know, May Day began in Chicago with the heroic struggle of anarchists and socialists for the 8-hour day, a struggle which continues for many. In honor of that history, I would like to start this episode with a quote from Albert Parsons, one of the martyrs of that movement. He wrote this from his jail cell, awaiting certain death at the hands of the state. To other hands are now committed that task which was mine, in the work and duty as editor of this paper. Though fallen, wounded perhaps unto death in the battle for liberty, the standard, the press, which my hands bore aloft in the midst of the struggle, is caught up by other hands, and will be, again and again, if needs, till the crimson banner waves in triumph over the enemies of peace, brotherhood, and happiness. And now to all I say, falter not. Lay bare the inequities of capitalism, expose the slavery of law, proclaim the tyranny of government, denounce the greed, cruelty, abominations of the privileged class who riot and revel on the labor of their wage slaves. I think it's a fitting start to coverage of workers' struggles around the world and provides a guideline for any who seek to continue the tradition of revolutionary journalism which he upheld. With that said, let's turn to the worldwide struggle against capitalism. We'll start in Chicago, where hundreds of activists and union members came out to a march in defense of the rights of workers and immigrants. Demands for an end to deportations were mixed with the Fight for 15 campaign and general calls for better working conditions. Police at the march demonstrated their vastly inflated budget with a fearsome brigade of Segway cops. Unfortunately, the police were not the only enemies of the working class present at the march. The leadership of the SEIU trade union and an Illinois immigrant rights nonprofit worked with the police to arrest dissident workers critical of the organization's conservative policies. Solidarity with Jose Garcia and Ann Wooten. A few hundred demonstrators marched in New York for workers' rights. In Seattle, a large march of hundreds took place during the day, and an anti-capitalist march was met with more intense police repression, with 10 activists arrested later at night. In Mexico, a demonstration of tens of thousands filled the streets of Mexico City to protest against the neoliberal policies of the government. The ruling PRI party is working to further privatize Mexico's petroleum industry alongside a host of other reactionary policies. Protesters marched through the city's main plaza, and one group took over the metro station to ensure free passage for everyone. There were protests throughout Mexico, with a march of anti-capitalists, anarchists, and communists in Monterrey, as well as a large march of workers and activists in Oaxaca. In Guatemala, unions marched demanding a higher minimum wage, better social security, and for the right to organize freely. At least 68 union militants have been killed in Guatemala in the last 7 years for organizing. Workers in Honduras organized marches and rallies, denouncing the oligarchic state, its destruction of workers' organizations, and its failure to provide land to poor peasants. Under the right-wing government which has dominated the state since the 2009 coup, Honduran workers have faced conditions of intense political repression and murder of union activists. Thousands of workers in El Salvador marched in a major protest joined at one point by the president. While the day was dominated by reformist speeches and politics, there was also a mobilization of workers critical of the new government.
Compañeros y compañeras, reciban un saludo revolucionario y combativo. Nosotros debemos de estar claros que es un gobierno socialdemócrata que no representa los intereses de la clase trabajadora. Nosotros debemos de estar claros del trabajo y la función que tienen ellos para con el imperialismo y la clase dominante. Para ellos es ese gobierno, no es para nosotros.
In Nicaragua, a large May Day protest was held with the participation of Daniel Ortega's reformist government. Thousands of workers in Costa Rica marched demanding higher salaries, better health care, and better education. In Panama, thousands of workers also demonstrated, with construction workers taking a lead in the marches as they are in the middle of a major strike, one which has halted the construction of over 400 public works, including the expansion of the Panama Canal. More than 10,000 marched in Colombia's capital of Bogota. More than 50,000 mobilized in protests throughout the country. While the protests did not directly face heavy state repression, the ongoing murder of union activists in Colombia by right-wing militias continues, as does the state's implementation of brutal neoliberal policies that have sparked a mass movement in the countryside. The traditional May Day parade in Cuba happened, with tens of thousands mobilized and marching to celebrate the gains of the Cuban Revolution. However, despite the public celebration of socialism, the Cuban government's leadership has been enacting market reforms to slash the number of state jobs, encourage the growth of small businesses, and invite foreign capital to invest in Cuba. It remains to be seen if this will spark a new wave of class struggle within Cuba to defend and advance past revolutionary gains against a creeping neoliberal turn. The Venezuelan government also sought to use May Day to rally supporters to its side. President Maduro used the occasion to announce a 30% increase in the country's minimum wage. The increase, however, is below the 56% inflation that Venezuela has seen over the year, sparking demands for more from the left critical of the government, as well as opportunist attempts by the right wing to use it as a talking point to win workers' support for neoliberal policies. The gap underscores the growing contradictions in the Chavista state. Ecuador saw 2 marches in the capital of Quito, one by workers critical of the reformist government, and one by public sector unions seeking to demonstrate their support for the state. Peru also saw 2 marches in its capital of Lima. The first march was organized broadly by unions and youth organizations around supporting the rights of adolescent and child workers. Later, a revolutionary class struggle march was organized by leftists.
¡Viva el 1 de mayo! ¡Viva el proletariado internacional!
Es así, y es hablar de la revolución, compañeros. La revolución, compañeros, ese es el camino del proletariado. ¡Viva el 1 de mayo, día de combate, compañeros! ¡Viva!
In Bolivia, the May Day march was headed by Evo Morales alongside the bureaucratic leadership of the Centro Obrero Boliviano. Morales' role in the march demonstrates the close ties between the union leadership and the government. While a sustained critique of the Morales government is beyond the scope of this report, I would highly recommend the critical works of Jeffrey Weber and S. Sanders John. Here in Rio de Janeiro, the left organized a small march past the occupied favela of Mare. In Chile, large marches led by the major trade unions were followed by state repression. Smaller groups led intense confrontations with the police. In total, 43 people were arrested during the protests. Argentinian workers and militants of the left rallied in Neuquén near the famous worker-controlled Zanon ceramics factory. In Buenos Aires, in the historic Plaza de Mayo, the Frente de Izquierda held a rally of thousands to commemorate International Workers' Day and mobilize militants in defense of the persecuted Las Heras oil workers. Students, rank-and-file workers, and militants of the left spoke out against the government and for the construction of a revolutionary workers' party.
Y que de una buena vez tenemos que marcar el camino para que no sea solamente decir que la crisis la paguen los capitalistas y seguir haciendo propaganda. Tenemos que intervenir y golpear en todas las fábricas, en las calles, en las Panamericanas, en todos los lugares y decir acá estamos y la crisis que la paguen las que se llevaron en palas, porque nosotros los trabajadores no estamos dispuestos a entregar ninguna derrota. Vamos a seguir peleando por todo y seguir coordinando y profundizando esa organización. Compañeros, feliz 1 de mayo para todos los trabajadores. La clase obrera es una sin frontera, a seguir organizándose y a seguir luchando.
Crossing the Atlantic over to Europe, thousands of workers filled the capital of Portugal to protest against the latest set of austerity measures being imposed in the country. In Spain, anti-austerity protests happened throughout the country, with Barcelona taking center stage with the usual flaming barricades. Protests were mobilized around France, but with few confrontations. The reigning Socialist Party government recently forced through a huge set of austerity measures, with major cuts to healthcare, social security, and social services. By giving a left face to these brutal attacks, the government has so far been able to keep at bay any mass militant reaction against the cuts. In Germany, major protests by militant workers and anti-fascists were met with state violence in Hamburg and Berlin. Thousands marched in Italy to protest high unemployment rates and austerity measures. Police attacks on protesters in Turin were met with fierce resistance from workers and activists.
Oh, bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao, quelli che passeranno
police, the Communist Party alongside affiliated trade unions organized a mass protest without major confrontations with the police. In contrast, the Turkish Communist Party played a leading role in street fighting with the police while attempting to reclaim Taksim Square.
İşçiler, emekçiler 1 Mayıs bayramında kendi taleplerini dile getirmek istiyorlar. Yani ülkemizde adeta bir diktatörlüğe varan bir iktidar var şu anda. Bu ülkeyi temsil edenin, yani sokaklarda mücadele eden bu insanlar olduğunu düşünüyoruz, bu gençler olduğunu.
May Day marches were held by leftist organizations in Palestine. In Bahrain, protesters continued their struggle against the government and were met by brutal repression from the state. Workers' marches were held throughout the African continent. In Ghana and Senegal, workers held marches demanding better working and living conditions. In Nigeria, the stage was taken by a protest demanding action to help the 200 girls who were recently kidnapped. In Kenya, workers massed expecting an announcement from the government which would raise their wages. Their hopes were disappointed as the government announced its commitment to maintaining low wages. Marches were held across India to commemorate May Day, with Delhi and Kerala having among the largest. Workers' organizations called for higher wages and greater social benefits for the working class. In Dhaka, Bangladesh, tens of thousands marched to demand better wages, safe working conditions, and the right to organize. In light of the recent tragedies which took the lives of over 1,000 workers, the demands have a clear sense of urgency. In Malaysia, unions and workers rallied against budget cuts and a new sales tax which will make working-class people pay for the state's debt. Cambodia saw a large protest held by unions and headed by the leader of one of the bourgeois opposition parties. Protesters had to face some of the most intimidating police barricades seen this May Day. Hong Kong workers rallied together around the original May Day demands of an 8-hour workday. Tens of thousands of workers marched in Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, for the first officially recognized Labor Day. Labor unions led the process demanding better conditions and rights for Indonesian workers. Finally, in the Philippines, smaller marches were held around the country, one of which included the singing of the Internationale.
Bangon sa pagkakabusabos, bangon, alipin ang puto. Katwiray mong sasabot sa huling paghuhukom. Gapos ng kahapoy lagutin, ayon api ay magpalikwas. Kamay, bayo, alipin subalit ating ang bukas.
Thanks again for watching this episode of Sin Patron. Solidarity to you all, and I'll see you next time.